Welcome, everybody. It is wonderful to see you all this evening, and thanks so much for joining us for this talk by Rachel Overstreet. The title of Rachel's talk is Advocating for Native Americans on Capitol Hill. My name is Paula Palmer, and I'm co-director of Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples, which is a program of Friends Peace Teams. I'm joining you from the homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples, which is also known as the Boulder Valley of Colorado. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mackenzie Barton-Rolich. Mackenzie, would you like to say hello?
Hi everyone, I'm Mackenzie. I use Z here or she, her pronouns. I am located on Duwamish land. The Duwamish are one of many Coast Salish peoples. This is also called Seattle. And it's really lovely to get to be tech support tonight. Looking forward to this talk.
Thanks, Mackenzie, and thanks from all of us for your technical support tonight. A few notes before we begin. We'd want to make sure that you're keeping your microphones off. Right now, we've got 26 people, but we're expecting about double that tonight. So we're happy to have you all with us, but we don't really want to hear the background noise in your rooms. So please keep your microphones off. We've set up the chat box so that you can only send messages to me and to Mackenzie. If you have technical questions, send a chat message to Mackenzie. If you'd like to ask a question of Rachel during the Q&A that will follow her presentation, please write your question in the chat box, but send it to me. I will read through the questions in the chat and address them to Rachel. So send technical questions to Mackenzie and send questions for Rachel to me. Our plan for this program is for Rachel to give a slide presentation, and then afterwards we'll have some time for Q&A. We'll make a few announcements at the end, and finally we'll ask you to fill out an evaluation form before you leave. So now I'd like to introduce Rachel. Rachel is a member of the Choctaw Nation. Before taking her current position with Friends Committee on National Legislation, Rachel interned in the South Dakota State Senate, working to create effective partnerships between tribal governments and the state. She graduated summa cum laude from the University of South Dakota with degrees in political science and philosophy. At FCNL, she advocates for policies that honor tribal sovereignty, help Native communities succeed, and repair relationships between faith communities, the government, and Native people. A main focus of her work is advocating for passage of the Indian Boarding School Truth and Healing Commission Act that probably many of you are familiar with. Rachel recently published an article in Friends Journal called Speaking with Friends About Indian Boarding Schools, a Native Perspective. We'll put a link to this article in the chat in case you haven't read it yet. So, Rachel, I'm turning this now over to you, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Paula. Halito friends, as Paula said, my name is Rachel Overstreet. I want to say Yakoki Fena Hoke to Friends Peace Teams, Towards Right Relationships, Paula, the staff, for having me. And thank you everyone for spending, about an hour with me today. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go from there. All right, so I hope everyone can see the slideshow. So getting some nods. And actually, before I start, I also wanted to say a big hello to Tom Kunesh. It's nice to see you again. So the talk that I'm giving today is entitled Advocating for Native Peoples on Capitol Hill. And I want to start by saying that I am not an expert, and I am only one small piece of a very large movement for Native rights across Turtle Island, from DC to California. And so this is just my perspective on the work that I do, the way that FCNL as an organization tries to conduct itself, my thoughts on, you know, the current administration, you know, things of that nature. And so I just sort of wanted to give my perspective and share, but I think this is just, I think, a jumping off point, and there's so much more to learn as always. And yeah. So, for a little bit of roadmap for what we're going to be talking about. So, I'm going to start with a conversation about FCNL's Native American Advocacy program, and also sort of the broader Quaker context for lobbying. I know not everyone here is Quaker, but as a Quaker organization, I think it's important to root ourselves in, you know, what we do. Then I'm going to talk about how FCNL approaches including Native voices in our lobbying work and how that's evolved and I think gotten better. Then I'm going to talk about our current legislative priorities. I'm only going to spotlight two. There's a whole bunch of things that at FCNL we work on, and even more things that we just track and try to follow. And I'd be happy to take questions about any policy that you've heard about. You know, I might not be an expert, but I probably know who the expert is. Even though in the talk, I'm just going to talk about two in particular. And then I'm going to talk about the Quaker voice for truth and healing, but it's really broadly the faith voice for truth and healing. And I'll get a little bit into that as well. So I'm going to start with this painting. This is a painting by Benjamin West, and it's called Penn's Treaty with the Indians. And the reason that I spotlight this is I think of this moment, right? So this is depicting a legendary, somewhat ahistorical meeting that occurred between William Penn, his Quaker, companions, and the Lenape people in Pennsylvania at the founding of the state of Pennsylvania. And I think this image or this historical detail will be familiar to anyone from Pennsylvania or anyone who's a Quaker, because it represents two things. First, supposedly the first interaction between Native people and Quakers, and also kind of a warm and fuzzy feeling that Quakers have about our Quaker relationships with Native people. Um, you know, I hear a lot, or I think there's a lot of mystery or mythos about the relationships that Quakers have had with Native people throughout the colonization of what is now the United States. And there is a lot of belief, I think, on the part of Quakers that Quakers have always done right by Native people. Or even if they haven't done right, they have done their best to do right by Native people. And the reason that I'm spotlighting this is because this is really not a true picture, right? This meeting, where it's, you know, beautiful and sunny and Native people and Quakers are meeting each other on equal footing, never happened. What happened is that a country in Europe, the United Kingdom, laid claim to an area that was populated by people who had lived there for thousands and thousands of years, and with no right, decided that a certain new group of people, namely Quakers, was going to occupy this land. This is a familiar story, one that's repeated across the country over and over and over. And while this feels like quote unquote ancient history, I think for a lot of people, what the truth of the matter is that this is the beginning of Quaker ideas about Native people and Quaker involvement in Native politics. And this is a story that doesn't start or it doesn't end here. It keeps going. And so when I talk about my job, the work that I do as someone who works at a Quaker lobbying organization on tribal issues, I am always trying to ground myself in the reality that for a lot of the United States history, Quakers have been imposing their thoughts, their ideas, their theories about what is good for Native people onto Native people. And this happens with Penn's treaty with the Indians. It continues through the Grant administration. It continues with the Indian boarding school and the Indian agent system. And it continues even through the 1950s and 60s with termination and relocation. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with all of those, programs and pieces, what I'll what I want to express is that Quakers have been advocating to the United States federal government, quote unquote, on behalf of Native people for hundreds of years, and only very, very recently have Quaker meetings, churches, lobbying organizations really found it important to ask Native people what they want before doing any of that. And that is really the what I see as my job as a lobbyist. My job is not to guess what Native people want. My job is to come alongside Native people in their struggle and our struggle as a Native person for power, for legitimacy, for equality, for treaty rights. So, um, that is sort of a really long, sort of broad overview of Quaker interactions with Native people. And there's, hundreds of hours that I could talk about that. But I wanted to kind of start off there just because I think it's important to know where Quakers have started to then talk about where we go. All right, so that's sort of that piece. So the next thing that I want to talk about is FCNL, in particular, our Native American Advocacy Program. So while it says on our website that the Native American Advocacy Program started in 1976, as I just said, Quakers have, outside of the organization of FCNL, have been lobbying on tribal issues since the founding of the state of Pennsylvania. And one particular example that I highlight all of the time in my lobbying work is Quaker involvement with Grant's peace policy. So Ulysses S. Grant, when he was president, um, was had a mind to create a new policy towards Native Americans for a whole bunch of political reasons. So, for some context, this is post-Civil War, and it's also sort of in the middle of or at the height of American public interest in the so-called Indian Wars, or the United States federal government's mass extermination campaign of indigenous people. Ulysses S. Grant knew that these wars that the US government was waging were unpopular, expensive, and not effective. And so he essentially solicited opinions from people of faith, from civil society, uh, you know, journalists, regular individuals, politicians, and wanted to create a new policy towards Native people on the part of the United States federal government. This eventually became the peace policy. Um, and part of the reason it was named that is because Quakers, actually in particular Baltimore Yearly Meeting, were incredibly influential in forming this peace policy. And remnants of the peace policy today that you might be familiar with include the Indian boarding school system and the reservation system. Both of these policies were new at the time, and they were departures from what the typical approach of the United States federal government had been towards indigenous people. We had gone from extermination, there was the removal process. My ancestors were, removed from our homelands in Mississippi to Oklahoma. And the new system that the Grant administration, with input from Quakers, Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, came up with was this peace policy that relied on basically the two equal parts of the reservation system and the Indian boarding school system. And involved in both of these things, deeply involved, were Quakers. Quakers ran and operated something like 30 Indian boarding schools. And shout out to Quaker Indian Boarding School Research Network and Paula Palmer for doing the research to um, learn about these schools. And Quakers were seriously involved in the formation of the reservation system and the Indian agent system that came along with it. So in this massive change in federal policy towards Indigenous people, Quakers are right there in the mix, and that continues not just through the Indian agent system, but through the Indian boarding school system. It continues in the termination era and the relocation era in the 50s and 60s. So Quakers have been involved in lobbying the federal government since the founding of the state of Pennsylvania. So I often tell that story to staff that I talk to as a lobbyist because their first question that they always ask me is, why do Quakers have a tribal lobbyist? They cannot get it through their heads. And I tell that story to say to them that this is not a new thing. Really and truly, Quakers have been involved in lobbying on tribal issues for hundreds of years. So that's sort of the backstory. So then, after the formation of FCNL, after yearly meetings kind of take a backseat from federal lobbying, FCNL starts its work lobbying with the Navajo Hopi Relocation Fund. So, at the office, we have some really cool old documents that talk about the interest of Quaker meetings in the Navajo Hopi relocation effort. And then FCNL begins lobbying on that issue for funding for it in 1954. And that was from 1954 to 1976. After 1976, FCNL really expands its Native American program because there was a really large fundraising effort to do so. Native issues become a lot more in the public eye with the American Indian movement and the Native Civil Rights movement. And so FCNL expands what it works on. And in the time period from about 1975 to about 2010 or 2015, FCNL works on a whole host of landmark Indigenous issues. So the Indian Child Welfare Act, which requires that Native children be placed, if they can be, with Native families first. The Violence Against Women Act, which for the first time allows tribal governments to prosecute individuals who harm Native women in Native communities. Also, a landmark act called ISDEA, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which allows Native communities to decide how they want to spend federal dollars in their own communities, and also funding increases for Indian education for the remaining day schools and boarding schools that the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Education still runs. So FCNL has a long history in lobbying. So then in I think 2017, there is a push to have a full-time Native lobbyist working at FCNL. And there's a fundraising push for this, and eventually that happens. And so there were three Native advocates who came before me. And then when I started, that program was originally a 2-year program. They decided to make it a permanent program. So, I don't have a 2-year clock on my work. And then last year, for the first time ever, we had 2 lobbyists work on the Native American Advocacy program. So we have a full-time program assistant this year, Kaylin Henderson, who works with me on the Native program and nothing else. And that had never happened before. So that was also really exciting. Um, so um, that is sort of FCNL's history. That's sort of the Quaker history of lobbying. And I know that I've been talking a lot about the past. So I appreciate you all for bearing with me because now I sort of arrive at the present. And I want to talk through how I myself, as both a Native person and someone who works at a Quaker organization, thinks about um, the work that we do and how we have desperately tried to model good behavior for allyship with Native communities. So, I wanted to start by reading from a document called The World We Seek, which is essentially FCNL's statement of belief that guides all of the lobbying that we do. And these are the two pieces of The World We Seek, the two paragraphs that undergird all of the work that myself and our program assistant, Kaylin, do. So I'm just going to read these because I think it's really important that we start here. So the first piece, Native American communities were decimated by disease, genocidal episodes, and deprivation of lands on which their subsistence depended. The impacts of cultural genocide, structural racism, discrimination, and oppression continue. Federal policies and laws must conform to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and recognize that Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Alaskan Natives retain Aboriginal rights. The second piece, treaties and trust agreements contain solemn and binding promises that must be honored. The sanctity of land, water, air, and all forms of tribal lands should be respected. Tribal police and courts should have primary authority over all criminal activity on reservation lands. So, the World We Seek, this document that lays out the work that we do, to me, reads as some very obvious truths, right? The United States government has entered into hundreds of treaties with Native communities. We should honor them. Tribal police should have authority on their own lands. Native Hawaiians, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives should retain Aboriginal rights. But this series of beliefs is not self-evident for a lot of people. And that includes members of Congress, that includes members of the administration, and that, I think it just includes everyday people who are not educated about the history of Native communities in what is now the United States. So this is really kind of a radical statement, I think, because one of the beautiful things about working at a faith-based organization is that I don't make any compromises when I talk about these issues. It's not difficult for me to say to, a member of Congress, you're not living up to the promises that you made, and you need to do better. And that is one of the beautiful things about the world we seek is that it guides us in that way, and it makes sure that as a lobbyist, I don't have to make any tough decisions about what FCNL believes. I don't have to sugarcoat it ever. We have plainly said the United States government has not now and has not ever fulfilled its trust and treaty responsibilities. And my entire goal, my entire job is to try to make it so that the United States government has some accountability. And that I think is one example of where working at a Quaker organization is so impactful, and where FCNL as a faith-based voice is able to be what we call prophetic. We're able to stand on the right side of things and not be shaken. So that's, the background, that's where we've historically been. So I want to talk about what that looks like in action. So this picture is a picture of a few, so I think about 150, of a group of young people in 2024 that we brought to DC to lobby in support of the Indian Boarding School Bill, which is the full name is the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act. So In 2024, we flew like 300 young people to Washington, D.C. We had a really strong cohort of Native young people as well. I think about 25 or so of the attendees identified as Indigenous. And then also just, many, many allies, young people who were invested in passing the Indian boarding school bill. And I love this picture for a few reasons, and I want to talk about two of those. So the first reason that I love this picture is because all of these people here had no idea how to lobby before we sent them to lobby. So in 3 days, we taught them about the history of Indian boarding schools, or as much of it as we could. We had Native speakers from Native organizations, including the now president of the National Congress of American Indians, come and speak about the importance of the bill to Native communities. We talked about why it's important for faith communities to be involved in this legislation. And then we taught 300 kids, from high school to college, how to lobby in support of this legislation. And as a result, we had, I think, a dozen members co-sponsor the legislation. We successfully passed it out of the United States Senate, and we passed it out of committee in the House. So this represents to me, importantly, a dedication on behalf of FCNL to lobby with and on behalf of Native people. And so that's one thing that really, warms my heart about this picture. The second thing that is so important to me that is in this picture, and I'll just be frank, is that this represents a massive monetary commitment by FCNL to continue this work. And we haven't had an event of this size since then, but we've had other events that FCNL has basically put their money where their mouth is and has made a huge difference in the progress of this bill. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the reasons that my job is so easy, and not that my job is easy, but one of the things that makes my job easier is the fact that we're incredibly supported at FCNL, and FCNL really cares about the Native American Advocacy Program. So I wanted to share this because I think this compared with this. So that was the reason I had these two pictures in here. So in this vision of the relationship between Quakers and Native people, it's not real. It's ahistorical. What we know is to come for these Native people is dispossession of their lands, dispossession of their children, all of these horrible things. But then, 250 years later, we have this picture of Native people and Quakers coming together to advocate for the fight for truth, for the fight for progress. So basically, sorry, trying not to get too emotional, but it's just very important to me to think about how people of faith, not just Quakers, but all people of faith, can be allies and partners in the fight for truth, healing, and justice. So that's kind of, the long story of that. So now I'm going to talk about details and what this actually looks like on the ground. So this is a little kind of three-pronged approach that I personally use to think about my role as a lobbyist for a Quaker organization. So the first piece, which is a phrase that many movements across, time and throughout the country use, is the phrase "nothing about us without us." Disability rights advocates have used this word. I know Native movements use this all of the time. But essentially, the concept here is that if you are advocating on behalf of a group of people, you cannot do that without coming alongside that group in a meaningful way. So at FCNL, we do this not just in our Native Affairs portfolio, we also do this in our peace building portfolio, in our Middle East peace portfolio. Every lobbyist that we have is required to consult with um, impacted communities, right? So, for example, in our nuclear disarmament portfolio, we talk every year with Native groups and downwinders who have been impacted by nuclear weapons testing. In our peace building portfolio, we talk with victims of armed conflict, and we make sure that our asks are not different than or are not opposed to what they want, what their vision of the world is. The way that we do this in the Native American Affairs portfolio is, just because I'm a Native person doesn't mean that I am able to decide what is right for Native people, right? I'm a young person, I'm one person, and I don't work at a Native-led organization. So FCNL consults with and works with other national Native-led lobbying organizations. So the two main organizations that we work with are the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and the National Congress of American Indians. NABS, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, is essentially the Native communities tribal-led organization that works on passing the Indian boarding school bill, creating a Truth and Healing Commission, collecting first-person accounts and testimonies of Indian boarding schools, and historically documenting the Indian boarding school system. So they do work that spans, survivor support work all the way to lobbying, which is the team that we work with. And so we make sure that everything that we do, we are in 100% lockstep with NABS. I text NABS policy director, Dr. Pankawi Victor's Kozad, probably twice a day to make sure that everything that we do, we are doing 100% together. And also that, FCNL is never, ever taking credit for something that NABS has done. The second thing that we do is what I call people first relationships. And I know that might seem a little bit, you know, redundant because how could a relationship not be people first? But I think, in Washington, D.C. and on Capitol Hill, there is a uh, very common way of doing relationships where they're transactional, right? Where you talk to an impacted group or you talk to, a tribal leader and you just talk to them to get what you want from them, right? And that is not at all how, I do things, or how I hope that the entirety of FCNL does things. What we like to do is build really strong relationships with our partners and not think of them in an extractive way, right? So the question that I always ask is how can FCNL help? And not how can FCNL decide that we're going to help, but really and truly, how can FCNL help? How can we be allies and not be speaking over Native-led organizations? How can we, be helpful but stay in our lane? And so that is, I don't think, universal in Washington, D.C., and I'm really proud of the work that we've done really since the early 2000s to ensure that we have real relationships with Native communities that are a two-way street. The last thing that I want to mention is that as a bipartisan organization, or really nonpartisan organization, FCNL has been able to be really, really supportive. I think in a unique way, especially when it comes to the Truth and Healing Commission. There's other ways that we do this, but so the Indian boarding school system, for a little bit of background, was funded largely by the federal government, but was began by and supported by church groups, especially historical church groups like the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, and Quakers. And so the Indian boarding school bill that we're trying to pass with organizations like NABS has a lot to say about faith involvement in and really faith collaboration in the Indian boarding school system. And a lot of legislators, especially Republican legislators, they reflexively think that churches must be opposed to an investigation into the Indian boarding school system because churches must not want accountability. And one of the incredible things that we can do at FCNL is prove that that's not true. Because as a nonpartisan organization, as a faith-based organization, and as an organization that represents, Quakers across the United States, we can say, no, that's not true. Quakers want this. We have support from the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, the Baptist Church, basically every major denomination that you can think of has signed a letter or written their own letter supporting the legislation. And so, one of the wonderful things about the work that we do is that we can step as much as we can outside of the bounds of politics and focus on, coalition building across churches and then between the faith community and Native communities. And that's really where, our value add as FCNL is. So to kind of illustrate that, so this is a picture of me with NABS's lobbying team. So on the far left is Ponkawi, then there's me, and then there's Taisha Ignacio, who's their policy consultant. And this is us outside of Senator Brian Schott's office. He is the vice chair for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Um, and this was a day that we had like, I think 5 or 10 lobby visits for the Indian boarding school bill. And what I love about this picture is that we're kind of all smiles here, but we have just had a series of visits where the staffer has said in the visit, after NABS is done talking about the Indian boarding school bill, the staffer has said, well, we don't think churches support this. And then, little old me has spoken up and said, well, actually, here is our letter of support from 20 different denominations. And here is the individual letters that these denominations have written. And in fact, here's 20 churches in your district that have supported the legislation. And the reaction from the staffers that we get is always, oh, I didn't know that. And they didn't know that probably because they didn't, research it beforehand. But really, what is so lovely about the work that we do with NABS and the lobbying that we do is that, FCNL, we get to play kind of the fun role of being the representative for the faith community. And we get to tell the truth, which is that the faith community is behind the Native community here. Native communities have suffered tremendously because of the series of Indian boarding school policies, and the faith community is here to say that was wrong and that shouldn't have happened. And we do a ton of work interdenominationally, leading the effort to support the legislation. And the coalition continues to grow. So that is really FCNL's approach to lobbying with a perspective that is really Native led. I hope that illustrates kind of clearly how large of a departure our current model of lobbying has been from the first interactions that Quakers had with Native people, and certainly from the actions of Quakers to lobby for the Indian boarding school system. And I think that we've come a long way. We definitely have more to do. There's always more to do. But we have just, I think, had a huge, leaps and bounds change in what the day-to-day lobbying looks like. So I think hopefully that was eye-opening and you learned a little bit more about our process. So what I'm going to move to now is our current legislative priorities. And I will pause for a second and say, we're now over a year into the Trump administration, part two. It has been devastating for Native communities across the country, in a way that is almost incalculable. Um, and I think there was a lot of hope early on, that maybe, the Trump administration part two would be more open to tribal issues, would be more attentive, would maybe have learned from the first go around. That has not happened. There have been, a concerted effort on the part of the administration to label Indian programs, and I use the word Indian because it's the word that the government used, not that I endorse that word. Um, and there's a consistent effort to label them as DEI, to cancel them. There's lawsuits ongoing as for that. Um, and all of that has made it very difficult to see um, progress, to see the light. And so I want to acknowledge that. At the same time, there have been quite a few things, efforts by the administration that have been soundly rejected, both by the courts and by Congress. And one of the ways that the Trump administration has lost on its efforts to dismantle tribal sovereignty is because of the House Committee on Appropriations. The chair of the House Committee on Appropriations is Representative Tom Cole, who is a tribal member. He's a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. And he has made it very clear that the Trump administration's attempts to defund Native communities is not happening. And while there haven't been any increases in funding for programs, almost no Native programs have been cut. There are a few exceptions where the administration has withheld grant funding. But besides that, Congress has continued to fund Native programs at or above the fiscal year 2024 levels. So there have been a series of massive problems. One of the things that's happening right now is, Senate is voting on the SAVE Act, which would really, really impact Native people. But there have also been areas where we have had either progress or we have not had rights stripped from Native communities. So I wanted to sort of start there and say, I can't address, certainly in this amount of time, everything that the administration has done. But I think there's room to hope, because Congress has rejected a lot of what the administration has tried to do. And I'll also say, I didn't put this on the slide, but FCNL's legislative priorities include holding the federal government accountable for any and all cuts that it tries to do. So that is something that I work on all of the time. But it's a little bit different than how we normally do lobbying. So I'll just say that. So the two bills that we're currently working on, that we spend, all of our time on, are the Indian boarding school bill that I've spoken a lot about, and another bill that I haven't said anything about, which is called the Badges for Native Communities Act. And I'm going to take these kind of in reverse order. So I'm going to start with the Badges for Native Communities Act. So this bill is S390 or HR 1010. And what it does is it addresses the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis. So, for those of you who might not be familiar, there is a epidemic of targeted violence against Native women, especially, but also, just all Native people, that is in every Native community and is targeted at every Native community. Some of the, I don't think there's any way to encapsulate the stats, but one of the stats that I always, tell people that sort of talks about the extent of this is that murder is the third leading cause of death for Native women. Um, just to get an idea of how horrible this epidemic of violence is. 80% of Native women report being a victim of sexual violence at some point in their life, right? And the majority of this violence is committed by non-Native people, which is a really important point to make. The reason, one of the reasons why this happens, aside from the, ongoing legacies of colonization, extermination, occupation, imperialism, is that the United States federal government has destroyed tribal sovereignty and limited the ability of tribal nations to enforce their laws in their communities for hundreds of years. And it especially has come to a really bad point post 1950. Um, and there's a whole, I have a whole nother talk that I give about that, so I really can't go too much into it. But essentially, Native courts and tribal police are not allowed to prosecute or arrest, except in some cases, um, non-Native people. And so non-Native people can go into a Native community, commit crimes, and then leave with the knowledge that tribal courts and tribal police have very limited resources and very limited pathways to follow them. And one of the really insidious parts of it is that often tribal police are not even able to report these crimes outside of the tribal community because tribal governments don't have the same access to criminal databases that state and local governments have. Um, that's for a whole nother set of reasons. It's absolutely ridiculous. And this bill, this piece of legislation, would remedy that in a real way. So what it would do is it would expand access to reporting databases for tribal communities. So, for example, if an individual commits domestic violence and a tribal court enters a domestic violence order of protection against the individual, this bill would make sure that other communities, state, local communities, border communities, know that that person has a domestic violence order of protection, which means that they, for example, cannot purchase a firearm. So the bill also does a few other things, but uh, this bill is FCNL's legislative priority right now for the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis. Um, Basically, for that reason, is that it puts tribal law enforcement kind of on equal footing with local law enforcement. And so we're really, really optimistic that this will pass by the end of this Congress. It's passed out of the Senate, and we're hopeful that it'll get through the House as well. Um, it's a really, really important piece of legislation. We're not doing any grassroots activism on it right now, but it's really important to be aware of. And I think this is a good starting point. If you're interested in the legislation, you know, I would encourage you to learn more about the history of the crisis. So then the other piece of legislation that we work on that I've talked a whole lot about is the Indian boarding school bill. This bill, very simply, would investigate, document, and hold public testimony related to the federal Indian boarding school system. So there have been Indian boarding schools across the United States for hundreds of years. And the federal government, the United States federal government, spent the equivalent of about $25 billion in today's money funding these schools. For a while, they were almost exclusively operated by religious communities, and then later it was expanded so that they were operated largely by the federal government. There has never been an accounting or a full accounting of what happened um, at these schools to a almost ridiculous extent, right? We don't know the full number of these schools. Every year, organizations like NABS find more schools that have not been documented. We don't know how many children attended these schools. We don't know how many children died at these schools. We don't know, in many cases, where the children are that died at these schools. And this is such a unbelievable delegation of Congress's authority um, to uh, educate, all American citizens. It's a massive violation of Native communities' rights, and the money that was spent to operate it was largely stolen from the money that should have been held in trust for Native communities. So the phrase is that's common used is that Congress or the United States federal government stole Native children using stolen money, right? So, there's some incredible pieces that have been written about it. I think this is becoming more of a known thing, right? We get less and less meetings where the staffer that we're meeting with has never heard about the issue, which is really exciting. And there have been a lot of, I think, in popular culture as well. This has become something that people know about a little bit more. But just, a public awareness of the issue isn't enough to say that we've addressed it. And this is the bill that would do that. And to the extent that we've made it a legislative priority, FCNL, we run a working group for other major faith groups that supports this legislation. And every year we expand the churches that are listed in support of the legislation. And very recently, actually 2 days ago, the Catholic Church, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, just came out in support of the legislation. So we've had some really, really important growth over that. Lobbying for the bill. So this is a picture of a fly-in that we had very recently. So in February, we flew out 13 pastors and faith leaders to DC to lobby for the Truth and Healing Commission. And the reason that the faith voice is so important here is because faith groups ran these schools. And as I said in the beginning of the talk, faith groups came up with the idea for these schools in a very real sense. And so it's so important that people of faith speak out loudly in support of the legislation, in support of the first step to fixing, or not fixing, but addressing the harm that the United States government has caused. And so the slogan that we use at FCNL is truth, healing, and justice. We want to start with the truth because, they always say that the first step is telling the truth, then healing, and finally justice. And we think that the Indian boarding school bill that we work on is the first step. It's definitely not the final say on the matter, but it is the first step to acknowledging the harm that has been caused. I also want to shout out two people. So in the front row, on the left, and then next to her is Pearl and Charlie. Pearl and Charlie are survivors of Indian boarding schools, and they're also faith leaders. So Charlie is a pastor, and Pearl is a lay leader in the Episcopal Church, and they have just been absolutely incredible in being just powerful, powerful advocates for the bill. So, what can you do? First and foremost, please, please, please write your member of Congress. You can call them, you can write them using FCNL script if you edit it a little bit. That is really the most important thing you can do, especially if you are in a Republican district or state. And then the second thing that we have been encouraging, especially Quakers, to do is to think about having your meeting issue a minute in support of the commission. And if you would like to do that, please, please email me. My email will be on the next slide. We have resources. We have a draft that we can give you. We have pointers for how this process can work. But the more meetings, especially or churches issue minutes and support, the better, because we take those minutes, we print them out, and then we hand them to your member of Congress. So it's a really powerful tool that we have. So thank you. The last two things I'll say before I take some questions is that my email is on the screen, roverstreet@fcnl.org. And then also I want to plug every month I write a blog called the Native American Legislative Update, where I talk about all of the tribal developments that have happened that month. And so that is a great way, I think, to stay updated on what's going on Capitol Hill and particularly what we're doing. All right. Well, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you
And I'll
so
turn on the light in the
yeah.
darkness.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Let's just take a couple breaths. Well, I invite anyone who has a question for Rachel to send that question to me in the chat, and I will collect these and verbalize them to Rachel. We've got one comment here, Rachel, from Jan Litscomb, who is someone who has been part of the Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples program as a facilitator in Washington, D.C. at St. Mark's Episcopal Church. And she said that they are showing the film Sugarcane, which, as you know, is about a Canadian school, residential school, and a very, very well done, moving, difficult film to watch. So that's a recommendation, I think, that Jan wanted to share with us. So one question that came up is, do other denominations have Native American lobbyists? And do you coordinate with those other Native American lobbyists or lobbyists from other Native American organizations?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The answer is no. Absolutely not. So FCNL is one of the oldest faith-based lobbying organizations on Capitol Hill. It's also one of the largest. And so we have been really blessed with the Quaker community's commitment to FCNL as a lobbying organization. Uh, the other denominations um, really don't have the same staff that we do. So, for example, they might have someone who works on foreign policy and someone who works on domestic policy. In FCNL, we have 10 lobbyists split between a whole, range of things. So the way that we coordinate with other denominations is usually they will have someone who is assigned to the tribal program in some capacity, and we do a ton of leadership um, uh, with getting all of those denominations to support actions that FCNL does a lot of the legwork on. So because we're the only denomination with a dedicated Native lobbyist, we are able to do a lot of things, and then we try to make it really easy for other denominations to co-sign. So, for example, we have written and do most of the lobbying on our faith letter in support of the Indian boarding school bill, and we just ask other organizations to lobby when they can and to sign it. And so that's how we do a lot of the coordination. That being said, other denominations do really good work, just not normally in the lobbying context. So, for example, the Episcopal Church has and as well as the Evangelical Lutheran Church, they have formed committees to investigate their role in the Indian boarding school system, and we work closely with them. But yeah, we're the only faith-based uh, organization with a full-time lobbyist. There are a few um, organizations that have smaller remits that have some tribal folks, but they're not with the same sort of global perspective as FCNL. So yeah.
Here's a question. Have the listening sessions held by former Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, have they been helping in your lobbying? Have you been able to use those materials in your lobbying?
Yeah, so we don't use any testimony just because we're not a Native-led organization. So as a faith-based organization, um, we don't use direct testimony of survivors. We focus on the faith role, and especially on um, the support of the faith community to have a commission. So that's really where most of our lobbying sort of leads. And then also, we spend a lot of time just explaining the bill. So, I talked a lot about the history of the bill, why we need the bill, broad strokes, but the bill is complicated. It's at least 100 pages. And it does a lot of different things. So most of my job really is to talk staff through what the bill does because they're really interested in the internal mechanics of it.
Here's another question. Are evangelical churches in the red states supportive of the Truth and Healing Commission work?
Yeah, yeah. So we just had the Catholic Church release a letter in support of the legislation, and I think you can read it on their website. That was a huge win for us. We've been working with them for years to get them to where that they can support the legislation. But also, one of the major organizations that we work with on the legislation is the Baptists, the Cooperative Baptists, particularly, is who we work with. Um, I think, weirdly, for tribal issues, the political uh, machine doesn't really pay attention to Native issues. And a lot of that means that major organizations that have a political take are not often interested in the Native community as a source for polarization. So I think a lot of the left-right divide kind of breaks down when it comes to tribal issues. And I think that's also because Native communities, by and large, are represented by Republicans in Congress. So the majority of Native communities are in rural areas. The majority of Republicans come from or are elected from more rural areas. So the vast majority of Native nations have Republican members of Congress. So that's another area where, yeah, the left-right kind of divide breaks down a little bit when it comes to tribal issues um, for that kind of unique reason.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Um, Here's another question. Are you hopeful for getting the boarding school bill passed this year? It's been moving forward for a few years, forward and back and forward and back and forward and back for a few years. So what do you think it will take this year to actually get it finally passed?
Yeah, I really can't say. I think if we weren't in the current political climate, I think this bill would pass. It has support from all of the people it needs to have support from. NABs, their political staff and their lobbyists are incredible. The bill is very popular in both the Senate and the House. I think the issue right now really is that Congress has stopped passing a lot of bills. It's become really polarized. And the administration has said that they're not doing anything until the DHS shutdown ends, the SAVE Act is passed, and they get another reconciliation bill through. The problem is that Congress needs to fight about doing all of that and also fund the government. Um, and Congress is out basically all of August and all of October for the midterms. So there is a very, very little time for the bill to pass the House.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think if if we were in a different political climate, I would say I think this is the year. I just am concerned that we won't have time. And I That's true not just for the Indian boarding school bill. Every lobbying team that is at FCNL is having the same situation where Congress is just passing way less than it ever has before. Um, that's not to say we won't try. We're going to try everything we can. We're going to try to attach it to any vehicle that we can. But yeah, it's going to be tough this year. I think um, I can't even give you a percentage chance or anything like that. I just I hope everyone keeps us in their hearts and holds us in the light as we try our best to get it across the finish line.
Well, I'm remembering, Rachel, that you told me a few weeks ago that there is some concern by some Republicans that this gets messed up with DEI. The Republican objections to anything that looks or walks or talks like DEI, and the Native people have been making a great effort to distinguish tribal, um, treaty-based, sovereignty-based work as opposed to DEI, although we all on this call, I'm sure, also support DEI. But anyway, that was one issue that I remember you brought up a few weeks ago.
Yeah, yeah, that is we've been NABs have really been doing a Herculean effort to dismantle that misconception. But truthfully, the administration has not been helpful on that front.
Mhm.
The Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice issued an opinion basically saying that Native programs are DEI. It was a ridiculous opinion. But that's essentially the administration's stance. So
Yeah.
I'm really hopeful that especially NABs can make that pitch and disabuse people of that kind of ridiculous misconception. Um, yeah.
And I'm not seeing any more questions right now, so please do send questions in. But in the meantime, before the call started, I was talking with Rachel about the SAVE Act. Um, in our most recent Toward Right relationship with Native peoples newsletter, we urged people to contact their um, congressional representatives about the SAVE Act. And for a lot of reasons, but Native people are particularly hit hard by this act. It will make it very difficult for many Native people to vote. It's really a voter suppression act. And so I just want to put in a little plug for people to be sure to contact. Even though FCNL right now does not have an action on this, Rachel assured me that they're very concerned about it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'll For a little context on why it's so bad for Native communities, especially. Like I said earlier, Native communities are often in rural places. And I was just at a meeting with the Alaskan Federation of Natives where they talked about how if you live in the Kuskokwim River Delta, um, the nearest DMV is 800 miles away from you, and it's not accessible by car. So you have to fly or take a boat to the nearest DMV. And what the SAVE Act would do is require every single person from these rural villages to take that 800-mile one-way journey to, Fairbanks is, I think, the closest. So um, it's a, you know, I think the arguments that the proponents of it are making is, well, you have to go to the DMV, for everything. But if you live in a really, really rural place, that's not true. In Alaska, you can get your driver's license by mail. You can get your birth certificate by mail. You can do pretty much everything by mail. Um, and so it's really, extremely rural populations that are going to be really, really, impacted by this. And that's just from the tribal perspective. There's a whole host of other, impacted groups. I know especially if you've ever changed your name, you're going to be in a difficult situation. So, yeah, it's a major, major issue.
I'm not seeing other questions. I'm looking for them. Rachel, in the meantime, we've got maybe 5 more minutes for this before we start doing some closings. Um, are there any other pieces that you'd like to bring to our attention?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I'll just sort of reiterate is that if you can, definitely sign up for the Native American legislative update. Um, so we really do our best to help people stay informed on what is happening on Capitol Hill that's related to Native issues. In this upcoming issue, we're going to talk about a major development, which is that Cherokee Nation citizen Mark Wayne Mullen looks like he's going to be the DHS secretary. He'll be the only the second Native person to hold a cabinet level position. But then we also talk about interesting um, ongoing issues. So we cover things that happen in committee that don't get a whole lot of national spotlight. And I will say there's some amazing Native journalists and Native journalistic organizations like Indian Country Today, Native News Online, Indians.com that do amazing work. But we really just try to get the, political angle on all of it. So I'll definitely plug that.
Here's something. We've got a couple more questions coming in now, Rachel.
Good.
So one is from an Episcopal person who is saying that they're working with the Episcopal Indigenous Justice Roundtable on boarding school research. She's wondering, have you or has anybody issued guidelines for churches on how to do this research?
So, FCNL hasn't. I think the advantage there is every church is so unique in how it's organized. And I have learned more of this. We work really closely with the Episcopal Boarding School Commission. And the way that the Episcopal Church is structured is just so completely different from the way that Friends organize themselves. And so I think that has been, it's good to let everyone do kind of their own thing. The caveat that I'll say is that, and I know the Episcopal Church is connected with NABS, is that if you're undertaking any research of this kind, absolutely 100% interface with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They are the experts and they have guidelines for how to conduct research in a really trauma-informed and survivor-centered way too.
Someone is also asking you to repeat the way that people can sign up for the newsletter. And we can put that in the chat. Right now, chats are only coming to me, but we'll put that in the chat in a few minutes. You mentioned two organizations you work with. NABS was one. What was the other?
NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians.
Mhm. Okay. And other people are just saying thank you, Rachel.
Nice.
Let me see if I've got something here. Um, okay. Well, maybe we are ready to say thank you to you, Rachel. And I'd like to ask those of you who are on the call to now put in the chat not a question. And Mackenzie, let's open the chat up so that we'll send these to everybody. So put a takeaway, an important takeaway for you from from this talk. And then we'll all be able to read what each of us is offering here. What's an important takeaway for you? Act and hope, nothing about us without us. New information. The importance of Native voices. Rachel's enthusiasm. Keep writing, congressional representatives. Just keep doing it. We can all play a part. Yeah. Work alongside Native people. The importance of faith-based advocacy specifically on this issue. Yeah. Letters from our meetings. Okay. Rachel, do you want to put into the chat now or did Mackenzie, did you put in how to contact Rachel
I put it
or
there
how to
earlier, but
sign up for the newsletter? Sorry?
I put it there earlier, but certainly we can put it again if you'd like.
Yeah, maybe we should, just because we've got this whole long list of responses now. And many people are saying, thank you, Rachel. So we have a few announcements to make about the upcoming programs that we're offering through Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples. We've got two of our Roots of Injustice, Seeds of Change, Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples workshops coming up. And Mackenzie is also going to put links to the registration pages for these upcoming workshops. One will be on March 22nd. That's just this coming Sunday. It'll be 4 to 6 p.m. Sunday afternoon Eastern Daylight Time. And that'll be 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And then we'll do the same workshop again on May 3rd. And yeah, so I think those registration links are in the chat for you if you'd like to come to those, or if you'd like to encourage other people in your circles to come to those. And I think we can take time now for you to fill out the evaluation form. Mackenzie also just put that in the chat. There's a link to a form. This will give you a chance to let us know and let Rachel know if you would like to connect with us or with her or with FCNL in any particular way. And it'll also give us feedback on this presentation. So please do click on the link and fill out the form online. And you can do that now before you leave. Rachel, once again, thank you so much, not only for this presentation, but for the work that you do every day. And we will continue to learn from you as we read your blogs and your newsletters, and make sure that you let us know also how we can be most supportive.
Well, thank you, Paula, and thank you everyone for taking time. Also, thank you, Mackenzie, for doing the tech, which is so helpful. I just appreciate having all of you here, and it's been so wonderful to share my small part in what we're doing. But really, it takes everyone. And so, write your member of Congress, and especially if your meeting would be interested in doing a minute in support of the legislation, or if you have a minute, you know, email me, please. So, thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.